Guys, I'm going to bring in Simon. So I think Simon will add to what Tarif said as well. Simon, I'm going to add you into the stream, and then we're going to go Blake and Christian. So here, South Korea man, and Claude is also in the house. Simon, are you with us?
Yes. Hello. Can you hear me?
Hello, Simon. I was listening into your into the chat here, and it looks like you've also got some interesting things to say about what Tarif said.
Yeah. I mean, I'd like to sort of emphasize what he's saying. The Chinese Navy is expanding at an enormous rate, but it isn't just the Chinese Navy, their equivalent of the PLA, that you need to consider. It also has the world's largest Coast Guard force, which has ships that are some of its larger ships are equivalent to a frigate. And it also has a police enforcement and a fishery protections force, which also can provide escort vessels. It has the world's largest merchant marine with over 6,000 vessels. And it also has the world's largest fishing fleet. And I think I can't remember the exact year, but I think in the 1980s or early 90s, it only had something like a few dozen fishing vessels. And it's gone from there to having an ocean-going fleet. In terms of the actual construction, it's building the equivalent in tonnage of the French fleet every few years. And the French Navy, to be honest, at the moment, is probably larger than the Royal Navy. It's an impressive force. Now look at the United States. The United States commissioned their new supercarrier, the Ford-class carriers, the lead of the class, in 2015. That's still not operational. So when a vessel's commissioned, you normally have a year or slightly longer to iron out all the kinks in the new systems. They've been totally unable to do that. And the previous classes of warship that they've tried to introduce, a sort of frigate-type ship called the lateral combat ship, that was a complete failure. And then there was the Zermatt class, which you may have seen pictures of them. They have a very strange look to them because they're stealthy vessels. They only built 3 because they were massively expensive, and again, largely didn't have any effective weapon systems on them. And the Americans are in a terrible position in naval terms because many of their warships are coming up to the end of their useful life. And effectively, the only vessel that they can build with a level of competence, other than their submarines, are the Arleigh Burke type destroyers, which are very impressive vessels. But China's now turning out its own equivalent of those vessels. It has something like 15 or 20 operational at the moment, and can build them at a much greater rate. Because the difference between the two countries is China has more naval building facilities. It has more naval yards. It has more shipbuilding capacity. And I would argue with anyone up to the C&C of the US Navy that if America was now to fight a conventional war against China, that the Americans would be in the same position as the Japanese were in 1941. A very well trained, effective force with excellent weapons, facing a force which, within a matter of years, would have such superiority in numbers and capabilities that the Americans would lose naval control. And I think that that's something that people are not even really considering. But in sheer shipbuilding capacity, that's something that China can achieve if it fights a conventional war. And I would say that if China ever considers this, one of the warning signs will be that China will start stockpiling and having strategic reserves of oil, food, and other resources. And I think if we see that happening, we should all get very, very, very nervous.
Simon, can I ask you a quick question? What about the quality of the Chinese ships and what they're building?
Well, in terms, it's something you will never know until battle actually takes place. But take, for instance, the anti-ship missiles that warships carry. The US main anti-ship weapon is the Harpoon still. That's being replaced. That's effectively a version of a cruise missile, really. So it travels subsonically. Most Chinese anti-ship missiles either travel supersonically throughout their entire flight and have a much longer range. So they have 2 or 3 times the reach that the Americans have. And also, they are now introducing hypersonic weapons. In addition to that, there's the DF-21, which is a ballistic missile which the Chinese have demonstrated against land targets has the ability to hit something the size of an aircraft carrier. So the Arleigh Burke destroyers that I mentioned earlier have the capability of shooting down ballistic missiles. How many missiles? But it's how many missiles they carry on each vessel capable of doing that is the question. But what I would suggest is that no US carrier group will go within range of the DF-21s, which is around 2.5, 3,000 kilometers. So and you think, and you also have to consider that the maximum range that a US air carrier group can launch an effective strike from is about 500 kilometers. So that means that they are massively outranged by the Chinese capabilities. And the American navies are very much aware of this. And they classify this as China's area denial capability. So it basically means that the US, in wartime, cannot send surface ships into those areas. And one of the problems for America is much of the seas around Taiwan and in the North China Seas are actually quite shallow. And that makes it very difficult for nuclear attack submarines to function. You're much better off using a smaller conventional submarine, especially ones which now the new technology basically can rely on an air-independent system. So the submarines no longer need to periodically surface to recharge their batteries. So the Americans are at a major disadvantage, and I do think they're actually starting to become. They are very aware of this, and they are trying to expand their naval capabilities, but their industrial base is really struggling to do that.
That is all fascinating, Simon. Thank you very much. Look, I should say straight away, I mean, I'm not an expert in these fields, but I have been aware that there is a massive Chinese naval program underway. And of course, have you been to China, Simon?
No, I haven't. But my last major contract was with a company, an English company. I won't say who it was, that did a lot of trade with Africa and South America. And I was invited out for a meal with some of the directors, and I was shocked and fascinated by their stories about the Chinese presence in Africa, especially, where they were saying that literally they were doing business in virtually every area, and this person had worked in Africa. He was UK based, but would go to Africa for 2 weeks out of every month, pretty much throughout the year. And he said that this was totally different from 10 or 15 years ago. He said it was an amazing change.
I have to say, I went there in 2017, and I went to Shanghai and some of the areas of the eastern coastline. And I mean, one cannot fail but be impressed by the sheer scale. I mean, it's like nothing I've seen anywhere else. And, you know, I've seen certain things in many places, but the sheer scale of China's manufacturing economy is awesome. And if any country can churn out just, you know, frigates and destroyers in 2 months, I mean, China probably is the country that can do that. I'm not surprised that they can do it. Yeah.
Alexander, Simon, is the play to, I mean, is all this being done for Taiwan?
Well, Simon,
both of you guys.
Well, I to be honest, there's an interesting book, and I can't remember. It was recommended to me by someone, and it's basically 7 disastrous scenarios. And I bought it because it actually had a scenario about pandemics. But they also had a very interesting scenario where Taiwan wasn't invaded by China. It was blockaded. And as part of the blockade, China said that they deployed submarine forces around the world, and that if any attempt was made to block the blockade, those forces would start attacking the merchant vessels of the nations that attempted to break the blockade. So I would suggest, if I was China, and given the fact that I'm sure they've gamed this out many times, a far more effective way of approaching the Taiwan issue is to mount a naval blockade. As I said, to break it, the Americans would have to risk combined carrier groups. So they would have to put 3 or 4 carrier groups along with all their escorts and sail in to this region where they will have to protect themselves against Chinese ballistic missiles, Chinese land-based aircraft, Chinese submarine and naval forces, and then Chinese air forces. And that would be the equivalent of going up against attacking Murmansk and the Kola Peninsula during the Cold War. And the expectation during that was that you wouldn't do it with less than 4 carrier battle groups, and you would expect to lose at least 1 carrier. 1 carrier has 5,000 people on it. You're looking at, say, 30 or 40% more casualties in a single day than 9/11. And a catastrophic loss in US confidence. So if China, I think, could do that now, and I think that the only reason they aren't is probably because they want to complete more of the naval buildup. But also, I think because of the path the US is taking, you could easily see major cuts in US defense spending, which will make the US even weaker. And there are other things they could do. You think about it. Think about a Chinese merchant ship, which might be like the one that blocked the Suez Canal. A couple of 100,000 tons with 20,000 containers on it. Now imagine 20 or 30 of those vessels sailing within 300-400 miles of US naval bases, which are virtually unprotected. And on those merchant vessels are anti-ship weapons that they can be launched from the merchant ships themselves. I mean, the Germans used merchant ships to transport troops when they invaded Norway in 1940. You could launch a Pearl Harbor times 10 against the United States. And as I say, look at any picture when you finish the broadcast. Look at any Google Map pictures of a US naval dockyard. You'll see submarines, aircraft carriers, destroyers all tied up in one location. And there's only a few US naval bases. You could easily destroy 2/3 or destroy or damage 2/3 of the US fleet in port in a matter of an hour. And all of a sudden that would change the naval calculations. In fact, I'm planning to write a piece for this for Warship Monthly. Because I haven't seen anyone else consider that scenario. And I think that would be an easy way to do it. And it would be something that'd be very, very hard to defend against.
Yeah. You seem extremely well informed, Simon. I mean, do you write regularly for these things? I mean,
no, I don't. I don't have a naval background, but I've worked for 5 years with someone who has a naval background, and I've always been interested in naval history since the first book I ever read was Prologue to War when I was about 10 years old, which was about the Norwegian invasion and by Germany and naval battles. I had friends and family who were in the Falklands, and people forget that during the Falklands, 22 British warships were either sunk or damaged.
Yeah,
that would wipe out the Royal Navy now.
Yes,
in terms of service combatants. You know, naval warfare can get very bloody very quickly, and no one's fought a proper naval war for 40 odd years.
Absolutely.
And so we have no idea. Please go on.
No, what I wanted to say, and just to add to the discussion and to go back to Alex's point, my own personal view is that what perhaps provoked the Chinese naval buildup was not so much the issue of Taiwan, though that's always there, but the fact that Barack Obama pivoted east back when he was president. And I remember reading all sorts of extraordinary articles that were appearing at that time in parts of the neocon media, about the US imposing a sea blockade on China in the South China Sea. So the Chinese, of course, all read all these things, and they decided that they would have to develop naval forces to respond to this threat of a blockade. Bear in mind that at that time, China was even more dependent on trade through the South China Sea than it is now. So I think that was what started the whole ball rolling. Maybe it would have started rolling anyway at some point, but you can't write wild articles like that and not expect there to be consequences.
Exactly. And to be frank, I think that's a perfectly rational thing for the Chinese to do. Yeah. Why would you leave your country wide open to a threat? And let's face it, I think this is the fundamental thing that people don't understand about China, is China has, as a civilization, very little experience of being dependent on other nations. It's largely always been able to feed itself. It's largely always produced the high value goods that it needed. You can look at the first British Opium War. The reason Britain wanted to sell opium to China was because the Chinese didn't want to buy anything that Britain produced. And therefore, the only thing they could sell them was opium, because the British Treasury was literally getting worried about the silver being sent to pay for Chinese goods. So I think it's perfectly rational. And I think the neocons, as you've correctly described them, I don't know if you ever saw it, but for once the BBC did an excellent documentary series linking the growth of the neocons to Islamists. It must have been made in like 2005 or something like that. And as you say,
I remember it.
Yeah, the neocons don't come from the right. They do come from the left. Yeah. And their attitudes are truly frightening because, as you often say, you and Alex both say, they are so detached from reality. But just to say one final thing, I don't want to take up everybody's time, but just with regards to what's going on in Ukraine, I think Putin must be very, very tempted by the weakness of the Biden administration, because a Russian conquest of the Ukraine would very much reduce the threat and give some real strategic depth to Russia. Yeah. And I think it's a tragedy of the post-war world that the West didn't adhere to the agreements we reached with Russia at that time and allowed a buffer region for Russia, because it is not unnatural for Russians to be afraid of invasion. Yeah. Because let's face it, they've faced it often enough, and it's a rational fear for them to have. So, but I would suspect that maybe Putin's real objective at the moment is just to put pressure on Biden not to block the Nord Stream 2 deal. Because I think he suspects, and rightly, that there will be better opportunities if he does want to annex Ukraine coming up in the next 4 years than there are now. Why attack a still strong America when it's going to be weaker in 2 or 3 years' time? Or risk the US intervention?
You are perfectly right, by the way, when you say that there are voices in Russia which say that the moment is to strike in Ukraine is now. There are some extraordinarily purple comments appearing in Russian talk shows, and the Kremlin has become concerned about this. And it's actually, Peskov, Putin's spokesman, actually said, these things aren't, they don't reflect policy, and we want all this to dial down. We're not into that kind of game at the moment. But there are certainly people in Russia who think in exactly that way.
To be honest, though, I think if it does happen and there is a NATO intervention, I think the Russians will be surprised by how effective their new combat techniques are. Because I was watching a piece by a YouTube video by an American general who mentioned the use of drone warfare by ISIS against the Americans. And it was literally the small quad drones that you see. And they literally, the ISIS technicians, who are actually quite proficient, had developed a way of dropping hand grenades from these devices. And he literally said that this was a shocking thing. And literally, the US has no anti-air defense capability that's capable of dealing with that. They've got capability to shoot down aircraft, though it's not nearly as effective as the Russians or as widespread. but they lack that capability, and so does the British Army, and so do all NATO forces. And it could be very, very shocking for NATO. I think if they did intervene, they would face an almost certain military defeat. And I think, to be honest, a lot of NATO military are aware of that too. But thanks very much, gentlemen. I don't want to monopolize your time anymore.
Thank you, Simon, very, very much. Simon, do you have a platform or anything you want to plug?
No, I don't.
Nope.
I don't have it pulled up. I have a friend who's
get a platform. Get a platform, Simon.
All right. Thank you so much.
Simon, I will look up your article. Was it Warship Monthly?
I'm actually in the process of drafting it. Whether they'll publish it or not, because I think it may go against the grain. But they don't tend to publish articles looking at the future of naval warfare quite as much. But I'm determined to do it because I do think it's a real risk that people should consider.
Absolutely.
Thank you very much, Simon.
Thank you.